Welcome to the fourth in a four-part series that the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law has been doing with NIST. The first three of these series you can find on our YouTube, the Center's YouTube page. But this one today is one that we've been looking forward to. Up till now, we've been talking about different ways, different focuses on risk and on cybersecurity risk, and how to go about looking at it, how to go about working towards identifying the risk and what it looks like in different contexts. And today we're talking about how to quantify it and how to buy down that risk and what tools people are using to do that. And we have two great panels to do that. I'm really looking forward to seeing this myself, because these are some of the real people that I look to in the field when I'm wanting information in this space. We're also really pleased to continue working with NIST on this project, and as NIST really starts to move into talking about the next phase of the framework, the cybersecurity framework, the 2.0. We're going to hear a little bit about that as well, and we hope that we can continue to partner with NIST as they start to work on framework 2.0. With that, I'm just going to hand things back to Ross Noderf, who's going to help to kick things off and introduce folks from NIST.
Great, thank you very much, Ari. We appreciate it. Thank you all for joining. Sorry for the initial audio issues, but I think we should be back on track now. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Stein. So the panelists will be on shortly thereafter, but I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Stein from NIST, who can give us a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into the panel. Thank you very much.
Hey, good morning, everybody. And thanks, Ari, and thanks, Ross, for the introduction. And I'd say more importantly, for your partnership and collaboration, not just through this series of events over the last several months, but in so many different ways. So definitely appreciate the opportunity to work with you and be able to kick off this important event today. We're definitely pleased to continue the cybersecurity risk management series. These webinars have presented just an excellent opportunity for stakeholder discussion on these really important topics and very timely topics as well. I think over the last three virtual events, we've discussed, a broad range of topics, including cybersecurity risk management considerations and supply chains for nonprofits, and also related to international standards and practices. I think today's session is going to focus on quantifying the risks that are facing an organization and how to effectively and efficiently allocate resources to mitigate those cybersecurity risks. We definitely appreciated the chance to co-host these events with the center and really look forward to continued collaboration on bringing together stakeholders for discussion around cybersecurity risk management. I was thinking, though, to help further set the stage, I'd like to share some updates on some key efforts at NIST that very much align and help to inform and influence our activities in this space. As you heard from Ari and Ross, and definitely in some of the previous sessions, the cybersecurity framework continues to be a focal point to help organizations better understand, manage, and communicate cybersecurity risk. And as many of you know, the CSF is voluntary guidance for industry, certainly required for federal agencies, but it's voluntary guidance that's based on existing standards, guides, and practices for organizations to better manage and reduce cybersecurity risk. And in addition to helping organizations, hope everybody's hearing me okay.
Yep, you're good. You're good. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, you're fine, Kevin.
Perfect, thanks. But I think in addition to helping organizations manage and reduce risk, the CSF was designed to help foster risk and cybersecurity management communications among both internal and external stakeholders. And that communication kind of value proposition has certainly been key, and we've seen that kind of play out over the last several years. It's been increasingly used. We've been thrilled with the diverse uptake of the CSF over the almost 8 years since it was initially released. And we've seen that adoption across all sectors and segments of the economy, across all layers of government, and even internationally. And we've learned a lot based on those experiences that you all have shared with us. So we are planning an update to the CSF in the very near future, and we look forward to getting your feedback from all of you. Shortly, a request for information will be released, likely within the next couple of weeks or so. And we encourage you to consider providing that feedback to us to help inform updates. Stakeholder input, again, has always been very valuable for us in these update processes to ensure the CSF continues to be a very helpful tool and is relevant to the challenges that you're facing within your organizations. So as we discussed in some of the previous webinars and sessions, this work is now truly international. We spoke about the ISO technical specification 27110, which leverages the content and the approach of the cybersecurity framework. And this is an area NIST continues to participate in and contribute to cybersecurity discussions within ISO. And you've also heard us discuss in previous sessions the work we're continuing under the most recent executive order, EO 14028, which charges multiple agencies, including NIST, with enhancing cybersecurity through a variety of initiatives related to the security integrity of the software supply chain. Your feedback, again, throughout that process has informed our development of various resources, and we've also identified some important opportunities to leverage and extend even, beyond the work we've done in response to the EO to some other critical areas. In one example, we recently launched the National Initiative for Improving Cybersecurity in Supply Chains. We refer to this as NICS, and that's really intended to help address supply chain cybersecurity risks broadly. We view this as a wide-ranging public-private partnership that's going to focus on identifying the tools and guidance for technology developers and providers, as well as performance-oriented guidance for those acquiring technologies, whether that's IT or operational technologies, IoT, even looking at not just software like the scope of the executive order directs, but extending that to firmware and hardware as well. So a pretty broad technology-focused and performance-focused approach to considering cybersecurity risks in supply chains. So through the RFI that I mentioned, we're also going to be seeking information on how our cybersecurity supply chain risk management and related efforts, including but not limited to NICS, can be better integrated and aligned with the cybersecurity framework. So looking at today's agenda, we're going to hear from leaders from government and industry to discuss various approaches and aspects of quantifying and buying down cybersecurity risk. Our speakers come from a variety of places, including the National Security Council, NIST, CISA, the Cyber Risk Institute, my former colleague from NIST, Nate Lesser at Children's National Hospital now, and many more. So we're excited to hear from everybody today, and thank you for your participation. I think to help set this up, the increasing frequency, creativity, and the severity of cybersecurity attacks means that all enterprises should ensure that cybersecurity risk is receiving that appropriate attention within their enterprise risk management or their ERM programs. This is certainly a challenging topic for sure. We know that a cybersecurity program that is 99% effective at warding off attackers can still lead to a catastrophic incident in that 1% gap. So definitely something that is top of mind for all of our organizations, including at the executive and enterprise level. But those challenges only make it more important that we align our cybersecurity programs more with broader risk programs so that organizations can plan and invest accordingly. NIST has begun to offer a variety of resources in this area that were developed with stakeholder collaboration. And you're going to hear more from us today about these types of resources that really help organizations more effectively integrate cybersecurity and enterprise risk activities, which in our guidance, we refer to this as our 8286 series. Maybe some of you are familiar with those resources. These guides are intended to help individual organizations within an enterprise improve their cybersecurity risk information, which they provide as inputs to the enterprise's ERM processes through communications and risk information sharing. And by doing so, enterprises and all the component organizations can better identify, assess, and manage their cybersecurity risks in the context of their broader mission and business objectives. So just yesterday, we released the next part of that series, that next guide, which we call 8286C. We released that late yesterday for comment, so we're looking forward to getting comments from folks on that. And my colleague from NIST, Steve Quinn, is going to provide additional information on all of these resources and how you can best contribute to their development. But we think this coupling of the cybersecurity framework and the ERM-focused 8286 series really helped to make cybersecurity risk management much more powerful, practical, and actionable for users. So we look forward to your feedback to help make that true. So in closing, look, thanks again for all of your attendance today, and thanks to our panelists for sharing your perspectives. And again, thanks to the Center and Ari and Ross specifically for all of your efforts and your partnership. So I look forward to hearing today's discussions. And now I'll turn it back over to Ross and Ari. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's great. And we look forward to continuing to work with you guys around the CSF 2.0 and the future work that you guys are doing around cybersecurity risk management. With that, I will turn it over to Steve Quinn to give us a brief rundown on some of the work he's been doing, and then he can then roll in and introduce the panelists. So, Stephen, over to you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? I know that's a rhetorical question at this point in time. I see a yes, so I think we're on. So thank you and welcome. I'm going to expand a little bit on what Ari and Kevin have already said. I have to confess, this is I'm the moderator here, but I feel like I'm coming into a team that already knows each other very, very well. The team, the panelists that are assembled today, I hope to embarrass them by heaping praise on them. But the panel started pretty much last night as we exchanged emails late into the evening. So just a really talented, professional, excellent, and experienced group of panelists here who I will introduce in just a minute. So I'm going to try to share with you some slides here. No promises, but we'll do our best. See what comes up here. All right. So we should be seeing a slide presentation. Does anybody see anything on their screen? Or did that not work out okay? Okay, great. Okay, moving on. So as Kevin mentioned earlier, most folks are familiar with the cybersecurity framework, and that's fantastic. We are really, cybersecurity framework is obviously not a risk management tool specifically, but it certainly interplays with it, and it needed coupled with a risk management process in any one of those. So we've done a really good job, I think, you'll tell me because we're out for public comment, on NIST 8286C, which integrates the cybersecurity framework with this risk management process focused around the evolution of the risk register. But before I get into that, that's just a little teaser. A little bit about where we've been. I have about 5 slides I want to share with you, and they'll be available after the presentation. At NIST, we use lots of numbers, and I apologize. The next slide will give you titles. But I wanted to just let the folks know for the last 2 years, we've really been focusing on all of the risk management disciplines we have at NIST and integrating them under the umbrella of enterprise risk management, rather than having the boardroom learn the language of each one of the risk disciplines. And I say that, I mean privacy and cybersecurity and information technology, AI, those more technology-oriented and data privacy frameworks. Rather than have them learn that language, we recognize when you get to the very top of the ERP and you're looking at that high prioritized item on the risk register, which is now the enterprise risk profile, it comes down, it gets rolled up into one very small bucket. And so we really wanted to not try to force the language of these disciplines into the boardroom where decisions are made. We wanted to let them continue to use the language they're familiar with, and maybe force some of that language, and more importantly, some of the CBK, the common body of knowledge language and risk management, down into the technologies at NIST. Sometimes in the government, we have a habit of creating something that's very government specific when it has an analog in the common body of knowledge of risk management. So this whole series was focused on being educational, but also pointing out that risk management's risk management, whether you're inside the government or whether you're outside the federal government in that space. The processes are very similar. The aggregation, normalization, prioritization, all very similar, whether you're working, no matter what org type or org structure you're dealing with. So this first slide really tells you there's been an evolution, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can see on the far right, we started with an interagency series. It's called a NIST interagency report. There's kind of 3 levels of standards at NIST. There's interagency reports, there's special publications, and then there's FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standards. And the reason we started this as a NIST IR is because we wanted a couple of years of dialogue. This represents a bit of a shift in some of our traditional risk management approaches. So we wanted, and we've received thousands of comments and feedback to help inform our guidance documents to make sure the umbrella which we're setting here is large enough to include the selections of methodologies that people find important for their mission. So we're not overly prescriptive, but I will say this, it's the first series, it's the first NIST document to recognize and coalesce around the risk register. And that may be very common as a standard industry practice, but not necessarily so, certainly from NIST guidance in the past. And so we've kind of taken the approach, if you remember the 1970s, how a bill becomes a law. Maybe you can kind of hum that little tune or look that up on YouTube. You'll find that we've really tried to keep the messaging with the risk register, you know, of course, the supporting RDR, the risk detail report, that whole process of how it becomes an ERP and keeping anchored in that central theme, we branch out into the discussions of enterprise risk management. So the publications themselves, real quick, for the integrating specifically cybersecurity into enterprise risk management, 8286A was published as final in October of 2021. And what that did is it decomposed, I should have put on the slide here, the NIST IR 8286, which is integrating cybersecurity risk management with enterprise risk management. That was the flagship document. And then we decomposed that into three shorter documents that is more of the how-to discussion. And we broke that up into 8286A, which is identifying and estimating cybersecurity risk for enterprise risk management. Then B, which will be final this month, for prioritizing cybersecurity risk for ERM consumption or inside the ERM paradigm. And then 8286C, which Kevin just let you know, was released yesterday in time for this webinar, which is staging cybersecurity risk for enterprise risk management and governance oversight. And in that particular document, I'll show you a slide later on that describes the CSF integration with ERM. And then we're also working on two additional publications Kevin mentioned. One is Special Publication 222, which is this integrating the risk disciplines for which we have charter from the White House or Congress to develop in our technology disciplines under the ERM. And so that's not just cyber, but that would be the rest of the disciplines. And then SP 221, which will be the integration, I'm sorry, that was 221. 222 will basically take the flagship 800 or 8286 and make that a special publication series. Moving into, I'm going to skip over this slide here. You can read it. It kind of, I've already done the voiceover on it, so maybe that would be helpful to go back and look at it. But this is really the vision from a NIST perspective, is we want to automate this. We produce so much guidance that we really need to be able to enable GRC tools and GOTS products to be able to download the JSON files that have all the data correlated all the way from perhaps the legislation or the policy through the controls that you may select after your risk assessment process to determining whether or not they're actually effective, and then back up through the stack. So this is a slide that represents a little bit of the way we're trying to automate the process in the background. I don't have time and it's not within scope of today's discussion, but happy to talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, this is what we refer to as the spaghetti diagram. You'll see it first in the NIST IR 8286A, which was part of the highlight for today. That describes at levels 1, 2, and 3, from the enterprise level all the way down to the system, this process of enterprise risk management and how it interacts at the system level from a cybersecurity perspective. It's a fairly rich slide, and I'd love to talk about it a little bit more, but it's really the setup to show you the overlay of integrating the cybersecurity framework inside the enterprise risk management process. And these steps 1 through 7 are detailed on the following slide. Again, the slides will be available after the presentation. But there's the very successful and widely known cybersecurity framework. This shows the coupling, the marriage between it and that risk management process here at NIST. So I'm not sure there's too much. Let me take a quick look at my notes. That's a quick little introduction and a discussion about where we were and where we're going from a document perspective. A little teaser about the automation that we're doing on the back end. Happy to talk more about that. But I don't want to waste any more time on this simply because the panel is absolutely excellent. And I want to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. So without further ado, I don't want to get the names wrong. So let me just pull these up, because if I call someone by the wrong institution or organization, that's not going to be good. All right. And there it is. So the first panelist that we have will be Olga Livingston. She's a senior economist from the Department of Homeland Security under CISA. And then next, Josh Moses, Director of Cyber Risk Management at BNY Mellon. And you can correct me, Josh, if I get that wrong. And then our third panelist is Josh Magri, President and CEO of the Cyber Risk Institute. So maybe Olga, if you could introduce yourself and to the audience, and then Josh Moses, and then Josh Magri.
Sure. Olga Livingston, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I'm leading cyber economics portfolio for CISA. I've been with agency for about 7 years now. My academic background is econometrics, and modeling and applications were a significant part of my experience prior to joining CISA. Thank you for having me here.
Josh Moses.
Sorry, my browser's
coming off mute here.
Sorry, Josh, please go ahead.
It's the Magri Moses overdrive. We do it all the time. So Josh Moses with Bank of New York Mellon as a cybersecurity risk director with a background heavy in the U.S. government. So I know we're going to touch on much of those topics, but my last stint was with the Office of Management and Budget, talking about these topics that are near and dear to our hearts, and now have the pleasure of working with Josh Magri, often in my capacity with risk and regulatory engagement globally. Mr. Magri, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. My name is also Josh, so it'll be easy enough to at least remember the first name of the panelists. I am the president of the Cyber Risk Institute, and the Cyber Risk Institute is a not-for-profit organization working to protect the global economy by enhancing cybersecurity and resiliency through standardization. We're not-for-profit with membership from the financial services industry, financial institutions, and trade associations, and we house and maintain the financial services profile. It's now known as the CRI profile. It had been known as the PHYSIC profile, and at points in times NIST Plus, which we can get into a little bit more in terms of the conversation later on.
Very good. So thank you for the intros. I have to admit, I'm not so great at looking at the questions, but if you do have some questions for the panelists as we're discussing, please go ahead and post those. And I think somebody's gonna cue me about that. All right. So I have a couple questions for the panelists. So the first one up is for Olga. And our question to you is, can you actually talk a little bit about the analysis you've published over the last couple of years, and what are some of the major findings in your cost of a cyber incident report, and what are some of the methodology used to capture and quantify the risk, and of course, how does this work relate to the NIST 8286A?
Yeah, we published a comprehensive study titled Cost of a Cyber Incident, Systematic Review and Cross-Validation. So study objectives there were to look at what estimates, what methodologies are available out there, and really in lots of literature, focus on assumptions, methods, data collection such that we can identify defensible estimates of cyber losses that are based on historical data, right? So this is what is the subset that can be defensively used for quantification, risk quantification and impact analysis. And we also wanted to understand the limitations of what's out there, such that we can potentially move towards addressing some of these informational and methodological gaps. So it was a really in-depth review of methods, and it established technical basis for doing this analysis going forward. So I'd immediately address how it relates to 8286. So impact estimation is called out in 8286A as one of the crucial steps. And the emphasis is on the availability and the reliability of the data that you're using for that. So this report addresses exactly that. Some of the key findings is, I'll mention some of the more dubious ones and proceed towards the detail without taking too much time. So one, obvious one, averages are a bad way to go. It's long tail distribution. Averages are severely impacted by extreme events. So median is probably a more robust statistic. That said, those are still 2-point estimates. So you really want to capture the uncertainty, variability in that data. Therefore, ranges and distributions are a better way to go, certainly. Now, some of the statistics, just to give you a sense of numbers, for public sector, per incident cost, so that's a cost per incident, cyber incident, is about 170,000. So that's median. Extreme value, 95th percent, is 13 million. Coincidentally, that 95th percentile in this distribution is also the average. So that tells you as to how well informed you'd be if that's the number you rely on. Next one is to emphasize that those are the portion of losses or consequences that are quantifiable. It is a recognized limitation that only some things are quantifiable and only subset is monetizable. So that's quite well explained in Limits of Quantification by Cass Sunstein, California Law Review, and it's a recognized topic in economics. So the objective reasons are there why we can only limit quantification to a certain portion of impacts. And sometimes we're, because of that, limited to robust qualitative discussion. It's the best we can do in certain mission spaces or types of losses. So please see the results in brief for more details. I would not encourage you to read the entire report. 150 pages are just exciting to read as it is to write, but the summaries are there. And then I guess practical takeaway is, if you see an estimate that says cyber incidents are going to be $21 trillion and you do not see methodology disclosed, assumptions disclosed, ask yourself, how does that compare to the numbers that you do know? What's a US GDP per year? 19 to 21 trillion, depending on the year. So what kind of a nuclear winter is assumed for that one event to wipe out essentially equivalent of the US economy in one go? So that it's just a practical implication of, here's the numbers that you see, here's the numbers that are defensible and you can believe, and how you use them to inform the risk magnitudes and then resource allocation. Over.
Thank you. That definitely answered the question. And we'll see if there's any, you can post as we go. There was a question, can we get a link to Olga's cost of breach document? So, okay.
I'll do the public service.
Respond.
I'll do the public service after this session, and I'll post all the links on LinkedIn. So just dump all the references there, so it's for you to use.
Very good. Thank you, Olga. We're going to go on to Josh Magri. I got a question from you. Did tell us a little bit about CRI at the beginning, and can you help us understand the work you're doing to better help banks understand their risk? That's kind of part one. And in the introduction, we did show the integration of the CSF with the 8286, and we know the financial industry has tremendous uptake of it and using that risk register model. How are you all, I guess, leveraging the NIST CSF in your efforts, and how does the series, the 8286 series, support your work?
So Steve, in terms of the financial services industry and the Cyber Risk Institute, NIST is the NIST cybersecurity framework is the backbone of what we've created in the profile. perhaps it might make sense to go back in time a little bit. So 2014, NIST CSF comes out. Financial services industry and the other industries all participated. Around 2016, we started to see from our regulators within the United States and abroad kind of a movement away from the organizational structure and taxonomy of NIST, and a lot more assessments coming out, which were entirely appropriate. You know, we hold a lot of valuable data, whether it be M&A or bank account data, et cetera. And so we were starting to hear from our firms that they were spending an awful lot of time of doing assessments and compliance related work. And of course, there's a dearth of cybersecurity personnel. So what we undertook was a project to essentially bring it back to the NIST CSF and try to weave in a synthesis of the regulations back to the NIST CSF. And a few things stood out. Within financial services in particular, there was a heavy emphasis on governance, and appropriately so, and not just the way that firms are set up with CISOs, et cetera, but also this idea of risk management. And we started to expand upon the NIST CSF in a, what I would say is a vertical fashion, where we added a new function, governance, and a new one, dependency management. The governance we stole a lot from the identify function within NIST, and we showed the work, but we also expanded it to include these ideas about risk appetite, risk tolerance, having those clearly defined by C-suite and the board, and running risk registers, et cetera. So the work that you all are doing is very much in line with what it is that we've mapped out, where we'd like to move from more of this controls and compliance type framework to one in which we start to move to risk statements, et cetera, with some quantification down the end. So that way there can be a more robust conversation between the boards and their chief information security officers and the chief information security officers and the CRO, CFO, and the work that you all have done with 8286 really does provide a nice platform that we're looking at to see how best we might integrate that going forward.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's good feedback. Our purpose was to provide that foundational information to shift the conversation to what's already best practice, and recognizing that we did have a lot of government-centric nuances to some of our current guidance. So that's really encouraging. I guess I can say I'm sorry we didn't get out there a little sooner, and that you had to pioneer some of that effort. But hopefully you can find it as more supportive and referential moving forward. So thank you, Josh. To Josh Moses, you have been at the policy level at OMB and are now running a team that has to fully understand the risk to major financial institutions. Similar question to you: how does the 8286 work complement and support? This is more for a federal audience. The A123 circular, A123 from OMB, and A130. How does the 8286 series help those to integrate in any way, given your OMB background? That's kind of question number one. And how are you leveraging the efforts of CRI?
Sure. So I love an opportunity to talk about A123 and A130. I joked with you before this of, who's Carol or Grant or all those folks in Grant I see on the call. But certainly the alignment with the 8286, it is a very welcome product from my perspective. Really that foundational how-to guide. If I think about the maturity from A123 all the way back in, 2004, and then the pull through on FSMA, and then the articulation of looking at risk assessments and annual assessments in A123, the maturity of A130 back in, I believe it was 2015, 2016, we got that one out the door. And then pointing back to A123 really as that foundational rinse and repeat approach for looking at cyber risk. But really the gap was, how do you get this back up to your leadership chain and make cyber risk a tier 1 priority? And I know that was something we pushed on very heavily at OMB. We married the budget to the FSMA data. I think we did this pretty publicly back in 2017, 2018. And you're seeing, that additional maturation through the president's management agenda and goals as well. So to me, it's a very happy marriage. It's exactly what I think we were doing with the CSF and a tie through there. And it's just a good continuum of saying, here's how we fund capability to address cyber risk in a way that is not yet articulated. So thank you very much for that. And on the CRI front, everything Josh said. No, in terms of, you're talking about the Fed audience there, I definitely had a very heavy bent with the CSF and thinking about its adoption back in the government with, what was it, M1501 back in 2014. So very early adopter there. Then coming forward with the adoption of the profile as well and saying, how do we bring more of what we did in government into the financial sector? The profile provides that same foundation, obviously marrying to NIST, but also providing a common foundation for firms to assess their controls, assess their risk, speak from a shared voice, talk about common priorities. If you think about this in the last 6 months, a year, and not that ransomware is new, but looking at those risks in a way that says, hey, we have a concern, our board has a concern about ransomware propagation. What are we doing to address that? We can clearly show our articulation of how we've assessed that risk over time, the capabilities to mitigate that risk, and then bring those types of risks within risk appetite. And that marries very well with what we're doing with the profile. I know Josh is talking about where we are considering those risk quantification pieces. And I know I'm one of those people who talks to him often about where we can bring more of that commonality in that dynamic risk model into the fore to give our leadership that confidence that we're leveraging a common best practice. So again, thank you for providing the gold standard, NIST and team. Back over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'd be remiss not to again mention that this guidance is, while we did put some ink and painting on the canvas, this is largely shaped by a lot of feedback from practitioners such as yourselves. And so we really do hope it hit the mark there. I'm going to go off script just a little bit. I know people know we're kind of reading some questions to tee it up, but we've been through the whole panel. And over the last couple of days, I've had the opportunity to really see what a cast of characters are on this call right now. So before I go back to asking any other questions, and just remind the audience, feel free in the chat to ask any questions of the panelists or any questions in general. We have used some government-centric jargon given some of our backgrounds here, and that's appropriate. So sometimes that doesn't translate as well. But what I did want to do is give an opportunity to the entire panel, just kind of to branch out a little bit. Josh, Moses, Magri, and Olga, do you have questions for me? Do you have questions of each other? Let's move into a little bit of a free form of the session, and then I'll monitor the chat a little bit. But I know it's off script, but I know the sarcasm. Let's let a little bit of that out and just kind of be a little free form for the next couple of minutes. Floor is open to anybody. I know you're not shy, so go ahead.
I'll hit on a point that we talked about. I know we traded before this panel was really the data points that we use for looking at risk quantification. I'll start with the conversation about what we did in government and what was the available data, and incident data is a foundation. But Olga, from what you're seeing, and then I think the pull from industry. So Josh, it's the pieces that you're hearing. Where do we see those common data points, or where else might we think we're going to pivot to, if not incident data, which is when it really hits the fan? What are the other opportunities for us to pull from a common set of data on what cyber risk looks like?
So I guess I'll start as while other methods are available to kind of plug the gap, the validity of any of the estimates is based on to what extent it's all grounded in historical data. So historical data is a significant limitation. And while on the loss side, we seem to have better luck, it's the likelihood piece of the estimation that's the proverbial, 42, how many incidents per year do you anticipate? And this is where if analysis is not so grounded in historical data, you might as well duct tape 8 ball to a crystal ball, right? Then you're going to get a number and a color. score and a heat map all in one go. Robust, beautiful, intuitive tool that gives you just about accurate answer that a Monte Carlo that's based on elicitation that's not necessarily grounded in historical data. So that is to say that there are techniques that DHS attempted, and then we had a follow-up National Research Council and National Academies of Science review of the methods that advise to keep these dimensions separately precisely for these reasons. So it's avoiding trying to tie it all together in one metric and understanding the uncertainty around each one of those pieces. It's not, the math hasn't changed for the last 100 years, right? It's a matter of what can you defensively use to parameterize the analysis. So I would not be a proponent of using something else instead of data. That's not the case. However, the recognized limitation is not quantification is not possible for everything. Example, election infrastructure, public trust in government institutions, some of the national critical functions. So it is a recognized limitation where it's not just the dollars that enter that decision. I guess that's probably the hopeful is estimated losses, stronger side of the equation. Likelihood is not, so let's not to tie ourselves to the numbers that are not defensive. Over.
Very nice. Okay. No, thank you. I think I want to go ahead and pivot to a couple of questions that we received. Thank you, Olga. I'd like to see the color of that report that you're getting. It sounds pretty impressive. A couple of questions. One was, is this being recorded? The answer is yes, it is being recorded, and I believe it will be available. Another question we have is, with regard to best practices, any thoughts on how data governance has better evolved to tighten the protection of data by end users, as well as its storage and management? And I'll throw that out to any one of the panelists who would like to comment on that.
Do you mind repeating that, please? That last one?
Yeah, sure. With regard to best practices, any thoughts on how data governance has better evolved to tighten the protection of data by end users, as well as its storage and management?
Well, I believe NIST has actually done some work in this score where they've talked about data governance and some of the best practices around it. But I think just even bringing it up as a topic, there's more understanding that there should be some governance around data, and there should be some thought about the data that's being held and the security with respect to it. Not to bring in NIST's other work, but to bring it in, NIST privacy framework talks about data governance and kind of thinking through what type of data that you should be holding and what context it can be used, et cetera. So I do think that there's a lot of work that NIST has been doing around data governance that should be mentioned and accessed by folks as well.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Josh,
I'll also say, go ahead, please, Josh.
Sorry, I was going to ride on top of Josh on that one, on not only that, but when I'm thinking about it, US government, but otherwise, right? If we're classifying our systems and looking at, FISMA high systems and from a CIA perspective, right? That clearly plays a role into how we're risk ranking our assets, what controls, what capabilities we're putting in front of them. And then ultimately, if we're talking about risk quantification, how we bring it all on home on what we're protecting. Is it we're protecting most what matters most, or feel like we've got adequate protection there? Where do we go to the next rung and move to further prioritization? So certainly as you mature in the space, it's going to drive your risk management decisions.
Yep. Excellent. And I would also say to stay tuned a little bit for the NIST special publication 221, where we're going to get into that a little bit further. And I'd encourage you to read the draft 8286C, which gets into governance a good deal. It also dovetails with this next question. I really love this question. I'd like to make a comment, but I'm going to throw it to the panelists first. And what exactly should the role of the board of directors be, if any, in terms of cybersecurity oversight? This is kind of a wish question for some of the folks on the panel here, but I'll say it again. What exactly should the role of the board of directors be, if any, in terms of cybersecurity oversight?
Well,
I'll take a, go ahead,
ahead.
Josh. First spin, just in terms of the meaningful challenge and understanding of what the risk is, right? Again, we're talking about risk quantification. So in that instance, what is the foundation for understanding where your program direction is going? You know, per regulation, and I know, Josh, you and I live this all the time, that is a requirement, regulatory requirement internationally for the board to challenge effectively what leadership is putting forward from a cyber program perspective, understand the risks and be apprised of them. So it's not just a once a year touch base of this is something I have to do because it's a requirement. It's really diving in and saying, okay, what is the adequacy of our protections? Do we need additional funding? The question I got asked often in the government capacity from agency heads was, are we secure? Are we safe enough? That's an oversimplified question, but it drives directly to what we're getting at here, which is, what is my basis for saying I need additional funding? What is my basis for saying there's additional risk out there? How do we marry those two things up and give people the confidence that your program is adequate to meet the risks and deliver the services, be it public or private sector? Josh, over to you, Olga.
Sure,
Thank
you. This is the aspect that comes into discussion quite often, is that when you think about risk management framework 837, that's the immediate thinking that we dive at the systems level, while 8286 talks about the integration of cyber risk management into enterprise and awareness of the board. So it's tier 1 all the way down to tier 3, not just right here, which is kind of directed by the objective need to have an ATO in place, right? So this is something that we're working on, is understanding the maturity of cyber risk management programs in place, to what extent the cyber risk management is integrated in enterprise risk management, and then what governance structure is there in place to tie all that together. So we're working on cyber risk management program assessment. And the idea there is, yes, some of these knowledge aspects reside at tier 3, but its awareness of tier 1 is what's going down the stream and up the stream, because budget's decided here, risk is informed from here. So this is summary of the summary, and I can go in more detail about that particular assessment, but just to tie it together, and back to you, Josh.
Thank you. And really to kind of pick up on some of Josh Moses's points, it's pretty detailed in SEC guidance and within the financial services within what we have known as the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, in terms of what the role of the board is. And the role of the board was really kind of delineated in the question itself. It's oversight. And as Josh Moses said, there needs to be credible challenge. That's their role, is to provide credible challenge. The one thing that I want to highlight is that cyber risk, however, it's a little bit different, but it's not so different than all the other risks. And so the board should be performing their roles similarly with cyber as they do with all the other risks that an institution may face. So, cyber is kind of a newer area of concentration. The board should be learning about it and engaging in things like the NACD and other board-related trade associations, and really just providing that credible challenge.
Yeah, so well stated. And that was one of the points of the series as well, is that cyber risk needs to be aggregated, normalized, and prioritized alongside of all of the other risks within inside of the enterprise. We couldn't have said it better. I think sometimes because it's newer, or perhaps some of the resources in the organization may have a better in-depth understanding of it at a technical level, it tends to be treated as special. And some of our effort here is to say there are special things about it and every other risk discipline, right? How you enumerate your threats is going to be different from technology to technology to risk discipline to risk discipline. How you determine your vulnerabilities, right? That's going to differ from place to place. But how you record that information, how whatever methodology you choose for calculating, your probabilities, to documenting that inside the risk register, all of that's exactly the same. So really, the plug-in interface, rather than treating cyber risk as a silo, separate and apart from ERM, was the myth we were trying to dispel. So you said it, Josh, just perfectly. The other thing that comes to mind here when we talk about boardroom oversight is the spaghetti diagram. And you're going to see this. In fact, the supply chain risk management document 800-161 that John Boyens and team just put out, you'll see this same spaghetti diagram again. This is starting to coalesce around this in the risk disciplines. And the reason why is you can take out the discipline, the risk discipline, where it says cybersecurity, and plug in cyber supply chain, and pull out cyber supply chain and put in privacy. And you're pretty much following the same process. So when it comes to boardroom oversight, you're into that enterprise mission, goals, and objectives. That's about as high as it gets into the definition and creating actual risk appetite statements. And then there's this entire spaghetti diagram that gives feedback to that upper level, whether or not those are they're even feasible, whether they're being met. So you start to look at your metrics associated with that as well. So from an oversight perspective too, at a boardroom, I would say we really focused in this series on communication, all the way down to the technology practitioner, all the way up to the C-suite. So I would encourage folks to take a look at 8286A and C specifically. We get into a good deal of governance that deals with enterprise risk strategy in that feedback loop. So
Steve, if I may just cut in, one of the things I think that you do quite nicely in 8286 is talking about, the board is supposed to help set the risk appetite and risk tolerance for the organization. And one of the things that we were seeing was kind of a conflation of the two definitions within regulatory space and even within some of the firms. The fact that you guys have separated it out and now have this document out, I think will go a long way, because of course they're not one and the same. Thank you for doing that.
Well, and if I may please add, if I may please add, there's also, there's between 82, 86 and 37, there's also 30, but also 39, which speaks quite eloquently to the governance structure that needs to be in place. So that's another element that addresses the role and the need. And at the end of the day, cybersecurity is a business support function. So this only makes sense to the extent it aligns with the Uber business objectives, right? So, and that's where the guidance, the insight, and then the challenge of the board makes this machinery work. Otherwise, it's a cost center, right? We're not informing the decision. So whatever is produced on the risk quantification side, that it folds into cyber risk management, that folds into ARM, it aligns with that business objective, and it needs to speak the language or context of that business objective in the units that are relevant for that mission. Over.
Stephen, I was going to use that
to
just pull a thread here, because this is another question on metrics that the board should see as sort of that overarching discussion. And Olga, it's a great point. Josh, near and dear to my heart, I'm looking at the DFS 500 here for those of you who fall within that space, right? And it's pretty explicit in terms of the types of things that the board sees at least once a year: material risks to the board, overall effectiveness of the program, and then material events or incidents that occurred over the course of the year. Now, there's clearly numbers you can put against those things. It's one of a series of examples that I know we live every day on information that flows to the board. But to Olga's point, whether or not that's good or bad, there's fundamentally this steeping in 82, 86, and 37, and 39, and back to A130 of where did you set your risk appetite? How did you apprise the board of that before you're providing that annual report? And then how do you continue to drive your program in a direction that mitigates those risks? So if you had, to your point, 42 incidents, whatever it was a year, is that good or bad? What's the severity of those things? how did it impact our ability to operate? You know, there's a broader context than just a simple metric. And in a lot of ways, I know this is a point we raised back in government, of it wasn't just what the metric was, is what did that reflection have to do? Olga, you hit it very well on our ability to deliver core service. And if we couldn't get to that point, you know, we're kind of missing the mark on our metrics and fundamentally revise them. That's where Mr. Magri is such a great partner of saying commonly, here's where we are trying to get to a standard approach for apprising, you know, our enterprise of risk, cyber risk. Over.
Thank you. I want to ask the panel too. There's some more questions we're going to get to. So lively discussion. Thank you. Just want to ask some of the panelists with whom you consult, organizations, agencies. In your experience, have you seen risk appetite statements? Have you seen those interpreted into tolerance and tolerance statements? Have you seen the KRIs, the KPIs? And how widespread in your experience is that being used? Or are you just finding that some of these organizations are discovering a risk register for the first time? They're just now differentiating between appetite and tolerance. I have to tell you internally, I'm going to leave that out there. Dr. Ron Ross is famous in quoting regarding risk management. There's one thing for certain in it, and that's not everybody's going to agree on the practice and the methodology and the terminology. So and it's a true statement. But at the same time, you know, we try our best to understand each other and how that rolls. But back to the original question, have you seen that, and are you seeing more of it with the clients that you're working with?
I can tackle some of this on the government side, on the federal side. So this is one of the specific aspects, whether it's a distinction between tolerance and appetite, or how well we're proceeding through the steps of that cycle, you know, overall risk management cycle. Those are all elements, essential elements of cyber risk management program and its integration into ERM. It seems that it's one of the recognized gaps, at least according to OMB, some of the GAO reports, agencies, inspector generals, that it is a gap. Now, does that perception reflect the accurate state of things, or we simply lack the visibility into that? So we are developing the CRMP assessment to address that question, is what it is that agencies are doing, to what level of granularity, the maturity of these practices, and once the practices are there, what's the governance structure that allows to effectively implement this. And essentially the assumption is effective cybersecurity depends or should be driven by a mature cyber risk management program. Tolerance, appetite, any of the sub-elements, those are just multiple manifests of what the state of practices is. So I would say visibility is limited, but it is a recognized gap, and we're working towards addressing some of that. So we really welcome partners that can provide feedback, candid feedback, whether it's something needed, wanted, the coverage, the scope. So if that's the interest, please reach out. I would really value that collaboration.
And
now to the private side.
I'll pull a thread there, because I'm going to use this as an opportunity to plug one of my favorite reports. I know I circulated beforehand, but back in 2017, we put forth, OMB put forward that risk determination report. I'm just going to cite from it because it said exactly what you're talking about. But federal agencies' approach to transparency and accountability, you know, by contrast, like the SEC requires private sector firms to put forward, you know, risk statements in their 10Qs and 10Ks, and a lot of those do articulate cyber risk. Now, I know, you know, my institution does as well. We note those types of instances, but across the board, you're seeing the prioritization of cyber risk and the use of those type of registers. Back in the government, this was a real factor, again, of how did we drive the prioritization of our funding, you know, servicing student loans, for example, and I'm picking on the Department of Ed here, servicing student loans versus making sure that the information, the PII that underpin those student loans is secure. That's a delicate balance, but you weigh those things, you know, at the top of the risk pyramid, effectively at that organization. Again, I know the 8286 is pushing that up, but I'd say not net new in terms of what we're talking about here on prioritization and funding.
What I would say, Steve, you know, with respect to your question about whether we're seeing more and more firms utilize the risk register and the approach that's laid out in 8286? The answer is definitively yes. Now, the financial services sector is a huge sector, diverse. There's something like 8,000 banks, within the United States, and then there's a whole host of insurance companies and broker dealers, et cetera. So has it made its way down the stack? I can't answer that, but I do know that cyber tends to be in conversations one of the top concerns among all within the financial services industry, and all are looking for kind of a better way to approach it. I'm going to put out a little bit of a plea here. One of the things that drove us to do what we did with respect to the profile was we wanted to get beyond the compliance and assessment type mentality, and wanted to move more toward this kind of risk and risk mitigation type approach that's laid out in 8286. We would ask that the regulators to help us out in that endeavor by utilizing kind of a consistent taxonomy at the assessment level, so that way the same people that would be doing the risk stuff from a technology standpoint can spend more time doing that than trying to rearrange various answers to various questionnaires.
Got to unmute myself. Thank you. It does answer my question. We're getting into the last 5 minutes here. There's one question I do want to answer. So there's a question about, is there training on the NIST cybersecurity framework? Amy, or one of the folks in support, could you maybe post an answer to that? That would be helpful to the audience. We're seeing that a couple of times. We have the four of us, and we have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to defer. I'm going to go in reverse order the way we introduced ourselves to give us 1 minute takeaways. So starting with Josh Magri, I think you were the last one introduced. Josh, for 60 seconds, what takeaway would you like for this audience to have? Remembering it's a mixed federal and non-federal audience. Is there any takeaways you'd like for them in the last minute here?
Well, I think really just the main points from the conversation, that cyber is not an island unto itself. It's something that should be thought about in terms of enterprise risk. So the work that you do, whether it's in the agency or within a firm, you should be contextualizing kind of the controls, the compliance in a way that talks about risk, and providing it to your CROs, CFOs, the ones that can help in terms of funding the projects that you want to do, in a language that they know and understand, because there are all these other risks out there, and there's been a move to kind of take an approach similar to what's laid out in 8286 for them. And we think that the approach that's laid out there is an appropriate one for cyber, and it will help, I think, for everyone in terms of having the cyber folks be part of the overall risk conversation, and not just this thing over there. So we really do think that cyber should be wrapped into the whole of the enterprise wide risk management approach.
Excellent. Josh, thank you very much. Over to Josh Moses. 60 seconds. You get to leave the audience with a final impression.
In 60 or less, right? So a couple of factors here. One, what's the path you're on from a strategy perspective? Trying to raise this up a level, and I'm seeing a bunch of questions about roles of CISOs, CISOs, CSOs, et cetera. And it's really, how is that individual or individuals level setting with your leadership about the strategy and path that you're trying to put forward for your program? Again, deliver on your mission, deliver on your core function as a private sector organization. That's really what we're talking about here. cyber, to Olga's point, as an enabler of that capability. There's no consensus methodology here, but what you're hearing is there are plenty of great tools. From Stephen's perspective, I think you've got at least a foundation from NIST that you can use that starts to step you through it. And then you mature that through the information that Josh has put forward or Olga's put forward, enriching it with the quantification over time. I mean, that's fundamentally how in my organizations previously we've started, understanding where you want to go and how you get there, and then setting on that course with your leadership. That's really it for me. Turning it back to you, Stephen.
Excellent. Just great meat and potatoes from the whole panel. Olga, 60 seconds. How would you like to close out?
So 2 main points, echo everything that's been said, is risk analysis is not a new field. Government's been doing it for decades. Think about nuclear industry. PRA has been done since 70s. Publications are there. New Reg 1150, year 1990. New Reg CR 41 with 5411. I'll post all of this on LinkedIn. That's a guidance on expert elicitation. Point for Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Point is, these techniques are mature, they exist. Now, is it done for cyber and is it done for all of the government? No. However, some of the agencies, DHS included, have gone through this steep learning curve and already identified what's useful, what's defensible. So let's leverage that, and I'll provide some of the references and we'll build from there. And a second point, being a mature field, there's Society for Risk Analysis, and they have a very valuable tool and more of a test. So it's called Risk Analysis Quality Test. I encourage you to look at it for the following reason. It's a very valuable tool for introspection as to how well you think you are doing, right? From all the practitioners out there and all other different industries all over the world. So it's how good you're hitting on your data, how good you're hitting on your methods, what's IV and V in there, and so on and so forth. So those are really foundational principles of what a good risk analysis would look like, irrespective of what the particular method you're using. So 2 things, mature field, and we can learn from that, including DHS, and then we can borrow from the best and brightest in the industry by applying these tests to what we're internally doing and think is a valid practice. That's the closing.
Very good. Olga, you're very popular in these questions too. If you could take a look at the chat and maybe answer a couple in chat, especially including those that are requesting links to some of the tools you've mentioned. I'm going to close out. I got the tap on the shoulder. For my 60 seconds, it'll be 30. I just want to thank everybody in the audience for attending. I hope you found the session informative. The panelist is just a rock star set of panelists. I encourage you to reach out to them and talk to them if you have any additional questions. And from the closing NIST perspective, the 8286 series and the special pubs that are coming out, you have the ability to comment and help shape these. I would encourage you to go to NIST or take your favorite browser and do a search on 8286. A, B, C's out for draft comment. We'd love to hear from you. We do dialogue sometimes with you on those comments, and we will adjudicate every comment that comes into us. So on behalf of NIST and the Risk Institute, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity of this panel, and have a great rest of the day. The next panel promises to be equally, if not better, in terms of its content. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you, Stephen Quinn, for putting that on, and all the panelists who participated. So we'll move right into this next part of the discussion, just to keep things going. Really quick, I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll jump right into questions. So keep them coming in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try and get to those questions as well. So Ross Nodorf, right now I'm wearing a hat from the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. Thank you to NIST for letting us put on this discussion. I will ask Bob Kolaski from the NRMC, this is NRMC, to introduce himself first, and we'll keep on going through the panelists.
Hey, Ross, how are you? Bob Kolaski, as you said, I'm Assistant Director at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where I get the honor of working with Olga, who everyone just heard from, and I run the National Risk Management Center. And our job is really to understand and work to reduce strategic risk to the nation's infrastructure from significant risks, most prominently cyber and supply chain risks. So looking forward to talking about some of the techniques we use to try to understand if we've achieved that aim of reducing risk.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Over to you, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine Mulligan. I'm the Global Head of Cyber Reinsurance Solutions for Aon.
Thank you. Nate?
Hi, I'm Nate Lesser, Chief Information Security Officer at Children's National Hospital. It's great to be with you.
Finally, Carol.
Thanks, Ross. I'm Carol House. I'm the Director for Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation with the White House National Security Council. So really focusing on ransomware, digital identity, and cryptocurrency issues up here as a part of our approach to mitigate national security risks from cybercrime and emerging technologies.
Great. Thank you, guys. All right, so we've got a good panel to follow up on the last one. Look, I don't want to draw a bright line. So we can go back and talk about quantification if it gets us to more of how we're buying it down. I want it to kind of be free flowing, and we've talked about it before. But just to recap before we get into it, I think there were some pretty good takeaways that were summed up at the end, right? So cyber isn't an island into itself. We need to contextualize it as we talk to people across the organization. Cyber folks, they need to be part of the broader risk dialogue and discussion. There are plenty of tools about how to quantify risk, and cyber just happens to be a new problem through which to look through through those quantification tools. And then we need to figure out, once we figure out how to quantify, then we can turn around and figure out what we need to do to either mitigate it, accept it, or shift it to somewhere else, right? So that's where we are right now. And with that, I want to jump in. I want to start with Nate. Nate, when we talked about this in our prep session, I liked kind of how you put it, but you work at an organization. You've seen the compendium of risk management documents that we were just talking about. You work at NIST, and now you're in the position where you're utilizing some of those best practices and some of the guidance documents to really quantify it and then to buy it down. What are the tools in your toolbox once you have an idea of where that risk is and what that risk looks like to either mitigate it, accept it, or buy it down or shift it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the sort of obvious set of traditional ones, right? We talk about from a mitigation perspective, people, process, technology, infrastructure. We think about the set of capabilities of a cybersecurity program. We think about how to structure those from a risk management framework type perspective or a CSF. And I think all of that is fantastic. There's also a question of the cadence through which you measure and rebalance those set of tools, right? So we find, and I think this is probably common across lots of organizations, many of us are over-tooled and understaffed. Often you come into an environment and discover that there are lots of things sitting on the shelf that were bought with the best of intentions. They were never fully implemented. They didn't work exactly as expected. And similarly, I think you have to take the approach of kind of cleaning house, of saying, like, on a pretty consistent cadence, right? Like, it's almost spring cleaning. You have to go through and say, does the set of tools I have, is it still giving me the value I expected? Are they working together the right way? Have I tuned them properly? And I'll speak for ourselves, and although I suspect this is somewhat universal, the effort to make sure that configuration and tuning is appropriate always takes more energy and more money and universally more resources than just buying a set of tools and the services that go along with it. But there's always, of course, the other sets of things you can do. You can accept. You can just accept all the risk yourself. You could do that and be done, right? That is one legitimate way of dealing with risk. There, you really need to have a knowledge of what you're accepting, and that's the challenge, right? Like that's where you go back to measuring your environment over and over and over again, and getting better as you mature at what you're measuring and being confident in the things that you're determining and reporting and sharing across your organization. I would say the last thing, of course, is insurance is a primary way to transfer. It's not the only way, but it's certainly one. And then we'll get into this later, but we as an organization are starting to really think about not just how do we balance that portfolio, but how do we start to shift those curves and say, okay, so there's some real activities out there that we can do to move the whole curve down. Right? There are some things that can reduce the cost of insurance for us. They can for us and the entire healthcare community, the entire critical infrastructure community, perhaps the whole cybersecurity community. And so we're looking for those kinds of collaborations. That's a big push for us.
That's great. That's super helpful. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Catherine, I want to shift to you. There was actually a question in the last panel, which I thought kind of set up this discussion nicely, but you're coming at it from the reinsurance angle from Aon. But if you could start by giving us kind of like a 101 on how does it fit together from an insurance standpoint? What is the role of brokers? What's the role of the folks who are issuing the policies? What's the role of reinsurance? Just help us understand where we're coming from, and then we can I'll follow up with the second question.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So we can look at this from a few angles. So we've got individual enterprises. So that would be Nate, for example, at Children's, who purchase insurance from an insurance company, and that's to transfer the risk over there. But then the insurance company has a whole portfolio of exposure. So they have every single individual insured that they write. So they look to buy down their exposure across the portfolio by seeding some of that business into the reinsurance market. So the reinsurance market is sort of insurance for the insurers. And it's really the backbone of the insurance industry. So that's the capital that makes it possible for insurers to take on the risk. And so the reinsurers are really taking on the biggest aggregation, right? Because they're writing every single insurer potentially who's writing every single insured. So that's how it all kind of fits together. And some of the pricing changes that Nate was talking about would also flow from the movement through the reinsurance space.
That's helpful. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what the pricing changes are, the marketplace right now around cybersecurity, insurance and reinsurance, which you were seeing across industry, right? Because you have a pretty unique view. You and Bob are folks on the panel who are seeing it across industry verticals, across different spaces. So I'd be curious. We've had ransomware attacks recently. We've had a spate of other big major attacks. How has that impacted the market from a reinsurance perspective? And then what are you seeing kind of down the chain?
Yeah, so I'll say this, that the risk management perspective of insurers is going to be twofold. So one, you have attritional losses. So that's individual losses that add up over time and erode the profitability of a portfolio. So that's one thing. And the second thing is catastrophic losses. So that's major disasters that will cause immense harm, immense financial damage. So these high profile events and vulnerabilities have really demonstrated that cyber insurance and reinsurance have to manage both. We've had a problem where attritional losses have caused really marked profitability deterioration for the insurers. So that's where buyers of cyber insurance are feeling this most prominently in the amount of premium that they're being charged for their policy. The average across the industry at the end of 2021 was a 70% rate change, but the swing was pretty wide. So we saw kind of portfolios with really no less than 25 to 30% rate change overall, and some well over 100. So it kind of depended on the mix of business that an insurer had, but they're all feeling this need to get rate to address this profitability problem. And I'll say that kind of tying into how Nate was describing the actions, an insurer is looking to manage their exposure to all those attritional losses with each individual buyer. So the first thing is in their underwriting process. So all the things that Nate was describing, they're trying to identify who meets certain cyber hygiene criteria to manage their profitability just through risk selection. Then once they've selected a risk, they're looking at terms and conditions. So that is the premium that they're charging, but also the deductibles that apply, how much limit they're willing to offer. And the availability of limit has come down in the last year as well. And then they're also hoping to provide risk mitigation support in advance of a loss. But after a loss, there's claims payment and response services sort of following the event. So that's all the actions that are happening on the attritional side. But then on the catastrophe side or the CAT side, these high profile events show that there's a very real systemic potential for cyber loss. So a mass ransomware attack, if it hits many companies, you can imagine how it would have a sweeping effect across an insurer's portfolio. And then again, for reinsurers who support many portfolios, the problem is amplified. So it's this reason that the insurance and reinsurance industry are really managing their available capacity very carefully and getting significant rate increases.
That's super helpful. That's super helpful. So I want to go slightly off script because we had a comment in the last panel about from one of our panelists about taking a hard look at what the numbers are that are being thrown out there and the methodologies that provide those quantification numbers. And I'd be curious, Catherine, and then Bob and Carol and Nate as well, if you guys had thoughts on the idea of this catastrophic event, right? This kind of black swan cyber incident that we talk about all the time. Do you feel like the numbers you're seeing out there are overblown? Do you think that they're on point? Do you think that we just don't know because we haven't dealt fully with it yet? Like where do you guys land on some of the numbers that we hear out there about the potential of the black swan just to totally upend the entire economy, et cetera? So Catherine or Bob, anybody, welcome to. Would love to hear what you think.
Well, I think Bob is probably looking at this from the broadest point of view, right? Because from an insurer's point of view, not everything would be a covered loss. So we always try to say we could put on doomsday screenwriter hats and try to come up with every scenario. But for us, we try to look at the likelihood of an attack, the likelihood of it being aggregatable. But I think Bob is probably looking at the widest scope.
Yeah, let me take a run at it. Hey, Catherine, good to see you. So, I like the concept that we've been using, which I think is important in a risk discussion of what we call a national security delta here in the risk. And, just like insurance is filling some delta of an organization's ability to manage and control its own risk, right? From a national security perspective, when we think about working with entities, our goal is to get them to manage as much risk as they can within their business model and give them information to push them risk, tools and incentives to reduce risk to their own entities. And when I'm talking about entities here from a security perspective, we use the term critical infrastructure, which suggests that that entity provides something that's important to the public as part of their business. But the delta part is assuming, and that, Ross, this gets to your question, assuming there are things that can't be controlled by the market managing risk up to where the market's going to manage risk, even if we shift incentives a little bit. And that's where the government should be thinking about reducing that delta. And when we're talking about the black swan catastrophe, I think it's important to recognize inherent resilience that exists in a lot of these systems. And so I tend to not overplay the potential for a cyber Pearl Harbor catastrophe type thing. There are certainly systemic things that could happen through cyberspace that will cascade across markets and all that. Things can spin out of control. But there is a lot of resilience in trying to push through the resilience and then recognize that some of these worst case scenarios, and I think there's a good transit over to the national security in Carol, where some of these worst case scenarios really do look more like we're closer to conflict, and there are other ways to manage the worst case scenarios than simply by expecting that we will completely reduce catastrophic risk. And so when it comes to catastrophe, again, planning and building resilience, and then creating the conditions where things can't spin out of control systematically or adversaries don't go in that direction.
That's helpful, Carol. I know you've been. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well. I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate the comments by Catherine and Bob on it, and echo a lot of those sentiments. Of course, from the National Security Council perspective, it is some of our job and focus, as is Bob's, to try to look at those low probability but potentially high impact events and to make sure that we have efforts that are underway on both. I'll say that, at least based on the approach that the NSC is taking, a lot of our focus has been on areas where we can have the highest impact that can mitigate a wide spectrum of threats, including the ones with the severest disruptions and otherwise. So I think that us looking also for the centers of gravity in the space, both on the threat side that we're trying to disrupt and on the vulnerability mitigations that we can put in place is a huge part of driving our efforts.
And I mean, are there more specific tools that you think we should be looking at for, I mean, Nate kind of walked through some of the options. So I'm curious, what do you think we as industry, as critical infrastructure, as government should be looking at to help remove or mitigate some of that risk?
Gotcha. Well, I'd say that one of, I'll walk through a little bit of our approach here and apply it to how it drove the development and pursuit of the counter ransomware strategy. So we use a lot of the same kinds of frameworks that are, well, we use the NIST frameworks, and all the elements that are present there are relevant in the policy space. So we're looking at the cyber framework and the risk management framework components of the NIST that were published earlier today. Congratulations to them. But we have to establish and understand our national security priorities and evaluate the risks to achieving those objectives. So we're looking at the same kinds of typical risk factors that operators do as well at the policy level, looking at the nature of the threat, really understanding that landscape, which is something that I do think at times that organizations sometimes undervalue and don't really try to understand the nature of the threat environment and how commonly their sectors may be being targeted. We look at the vulnerabilities that exist, the potential impact for them, the likelihood, any predisposing conditions that may ultimately sort of raise our risk, and then ultimately to decide, is that level acceptable, and if not, what are the highest impact efforts that we can drive to mitigate it, avoid it, share that risk, and all that is present in our counter ransomware strategy. The sophistication and severity of ransomware we determined was an unacceptable risk. So it's pervasive, destabilizing, disruptive cybercrime, hurting Americans and threatening critical services. So we had to do something about it. So again, in understanding the nature of the threat, we looked at and dissected that ecosystem. We understand it both as a cybercrime and financial crime, which has unique implications both for the threat and who is coming for Americans and who is culpable in that activity, but also the aside from the vulnerabilities, it also offers tools and mitigating factors that the U.S. government, along with industry, can put in place to try to disrupt that threat and mitigate that risk. So seeing this as a multi-vector threat, a multi-vector vulnerability space, as well as one with a lot of potential for mitigations. We developed our priority lines of effort, focus on priority actors and infrastructure for disruption, combating the misuse of virtual currency to close the vulnerabilities of an insufficiently internationally regulated system, bolstering international cooperation, which resulted in that in the White House hosted counter ransomware initiative with over 30 countries committing with us to disrupt this, since normally it's international, transnational criminal groups that are supporting this. And even the White House Kremlin group, Kremlin experts group, I think that's another indication of how we saw a potential for working with a jurisdiction where often these activities have emanated from, and determined that this was a dialogue that needed to exist. And the president has pursued it because he felt that that was a place where we might be able to achieve dividends. So, and then finally, a surge on resilience, where we have to focus on becoming a harder target. Really thrilled that Catherine's here talking about the cyber insurance sector partnerships, looking specifically at the unique role that cyber insurance can play as essentially a subsidy for poor cyber hygiene if improperly calibrated, or when properly calibrated, a really great incentive for raising the level of cybersecurity across industry. So I think hopefully that highlights the way that we've used it. I think tools available to industry can be a similar kind of approach of looking at the information that's available from government to help them understand the nature of the problem, understand the vulnerabilities that are commonly being targeted and compromised in the conduct of ransomware and other cybercrime activity, and figuring out what those most high impact efforts are that they can invest in. Just today, we announced the Water Sector Action Plan as our next sprint for the Industrial Control System Initiative. So congratulations to the EPA there. But I think that action plan, which outlines, again, some really key measures and opportunities to raise visibility across the sector, understand the nature of the threat. There's a lot of tools that are out there that the government is posting that industry can use to better buy down their cybersecurity risk.
Thanks. That's great. And Bob, I'm going to come to you and ask you the same question, but I want to take a quick detour to Nate for a second, right? So Nate, let's take ransomware as the example, but that is a huge thing, right? It's got a bunch of different vectors coming at you. In your organization, what are the tools that you actually are using to buy down that very dynamic, very multi-vector threat, just to kind of help crystallize it as an operator?
Yeah, so I mean, we can get tactical, right? You need managed endpoint detection and response. You need stuff on your endpoints that will isolate them, right? And you need tools that work really well to detect previously unknown variants of ransomware or other types of viruses, and then allow those tools to do the work of setting a device, quarantining it and isolating it automatically so that it doesn't spread quickly. You need tools like network segmentation. You need to be able to really kind of isolate parts of your environment and close the door and quarantine parts of your environment. But I think more than that, you need to be able to communicate. We talk a lot about cybersecurity communication, right? How do we quantify risk? How do we talk about risk? And it's almost always a kind of north-south communication, right? How do we talk to our executive leadership? How do we talk to our board of directors? How do we quantify risk in a way that business people understand? I'll tell you, in my experience at the hospital, the east-west communication is so much more essential, and it's really not well treated. So when we talk about cybersecurity communication, it's not just the kind of training and awareness that we all think about as operators. It's really how do I talk to units and departments across the hospital about what happens if we are in a catastrophic ransomware event like we've seen, right? So I think the black swan events we were talking about earlier are really interesting. Maybe we haven't seen a digital Pearl Harbor here in the United States yet, although other countries, Ukraine, have. We are in a position at an organizational level of absolutely seeing our peers go down and go down hard for an extended period of time. Every unit in a hospital has something called a downtime plan or downtime procedures. What they do in the absence of electronic medical records or in the absence of the use of connected devices to provide care. Those typically think about 1, 2, 3, 4 hour downtimes. They don't think about it in terms of 4-week downtimes. And that's the kind of east-west communication. When I think about buying down risk in the hospital, I will tell you it's partnering across the organization more than anything else with the other leaders and the heads of those departments and units who don't typically hear from the cybersecurity guy. Again, it's more often that north-south communication. So I think when I think about the tools at our disposal and what we really do, sure, there are technical tools, but probably the biggest piece of what we do to get ready for one of these events that thankfully has not hit us yet, or as far as we're aware, is to collaborate with our partners across the hospital.
No, that's super helpful, the communication. And I think that speaks to Bob, your point about, hey, look, we gotta be practical about the resiliency in some of the systems that we built out, right? Whether it's resiliency that is built on infrastructure or resiliency from a communication standpoint and a process standpoint. But same question over to you. I mean, you're looking at some of these threats, and we talked a little bit about it. But like, what are the tools that you're seeing cross sectors being applied? Whether it's use of insurance, whether it's communication, some of the other things that you're seeing across sectors that are common threads that people need to be aware of when they're thinking about how to buy down that risk.
Sure. I think that's a good question. So again, I think what we're seeing with trends is thinking about interdependent risk in a lot of ways, and where risks in terms of things that you bring into your own system as part of doing business, introduce new risks in the system, right? And so, the model, I like very much what Carol was saying in terms of kind of strategically what we're trying to do, but the model we're building on top of the strategy that Carol laid out is to understand functional risk. And from a national security perspective, we talk in terms of national critical functions and what it takes for things that are nationally important, the ability to have electricity and to vote, to conduct democratic processes and have core communications networks, what does it take for those functions to stay up and running? And I think the same parallel happens on the industry side. What are the critical processes that you must establish? Think about it that way. Think about how cyber elements can take down those critical processes and build resilience against that happening. And then to your specific question of how do you build resilience, it's having better planning, doing exercises, putting in the playbooks to think about operating without your core digital infrastructure working, along the lines of what Nate's talking about. It's thinking about zero trust structures within your digital infrastructure, which gets you to a better security posture. It's about your suppliers, who you're buying from, having more transparency of your supply chain, taking less concentrated risk in terms of supply chains. It's about having financial plans to operate under degraded conditions. And those are the types of things that, I think we all, it's probably a cliche for this group. Those are the types of conversations that can only happen at the sort of cross business line level, at the strategic level, where you, because it's building resilience requires so many different business lines operating together with that goal and prioritizing that goal in such a way. To your question of trends, some industries are further along in that. Obviously, understanding asset management, supply chain management, those sorts of things, it's going to take time to build out. But I think there's a real desire to do this kind of thinking, and incentives have been created that you have to do this kind of thinking. So, we want to cheerlead that continuing.
And that's great. And I think, you guys are already doing a good job of that. And I think that is a void that needed filling. And I think you guys are doing good work from the government perspective, at least to get some of that messaging out there. So, Catherine, that's like I took note about interdependent risk to kind of, because I think that ties into where you are positioned in the marketplace right now. Your perspective as kind of a derivative of the risk picture in the insurance space. Tell me about what is it keeping you up at night when you look at how these interdependent risks are fitting together and how cyber overlays on top of it?
Yeah, well, we look at scenarios based on the scope of their potential impact, historical precedents to the degree that such a thing exists for whatever we're looking at, the threat actors' capabilities to carry it out, and then really what we're thinking about is the problem aggregatable? So that is, can many companies be hit at the same time by this one event? So some examples would obviously include the infrastructure issues that Bob and his team are working on, but distributed denial of service attacks, cloud failure, certainly mass ransomware, mass wiperware. And the reinsurance industry is continuing to refine our modeling around these issues. And somebody said something on the last panel that was super. It was, well, cyber has some of its own unique elements, but sometimes it's kind of treated as something wildly different. And I'm always trying to bring that point of view back to center in the insurance and reinsurance space, which is the insurance industry was designed to figure out how to model risk and take on risk where that's available. And so I think that this modeling piece, we already have great thinking around how to model catastrophic losses from natural catastrophe, for example. And certainly the thinking on that is being forwarded because of climate change. So we can apply some of those same principles to the thinking around cyber, but we need good technology to be able to sensitivity test these scenarios in a way that builds their credibility. So I think that credibility piece is the next thing that we're kind of that we're working on.
Yeah, and I think if I'm hearing you right, I want to make sure I'm hearing you right. When you say we need the technology to make sure that we have credible models that we're building out, you're talking, is it a combination of the technology that's able to really help us assess the risk picture? Is it the veracity and the accuracy of the data that goes into that modeling? Is it a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a combination. It's a great question. So it's a combination of both. There are scans that are available that say, okay, if insurer A has 20,000 policies, what's the open RDP percentage of all of those 20,000 insureds? We know what the market average is, and if we looked at a market share percentage, so is that a better or worse picture, and what can they do to try to encourage those insureds to close that vulnerability? So that all would feed into the sensitivity test around a single point of failure scenario, for example.
That's helpful. So I do want to take a moment and encourage folks, hey, in the Q&A or in the chat, drop some questions. We're gonna have some opportunity. We're about 15 minutes out. I've got some more questions here, but if we see something good, we'll pull it out and ask the panelists. Nate, I want to circle back to you. We talked a lot about kind of the strategic higher level stuff. Getting back down into in policy circles, we talked about risk-based budgeting. There's been recently a provision introduced by the House in the FSMA bill for agencies to do a pilot around risk-based budgeting. There's a little bit of kind of squishiness around what that means. When you are working on your budgeting, how do you determine where to put the resources that you have, the scant resources that CISO has at their disposal? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, so I mean, it all comes back to this question of how you measure your environment, right? So I think Catherine makes a really good point, and you asked a great question, Ross, about this question of a combination of sort of accuracy and precision. I'm paraphrasing here, taking from your question what I want. But as you apply that to an individual organization, right, I think to a large degree, you're talking about a question of coverage in terms of your measurement. Are you really covering your whole environment? And then precision. The third piece, of course, is like the extent to which what you're measuring. I'll steal a title from a book of someone who I think is fantastic. Are you measuring what matters, right? Are you actually measuring the risk posture of your environment, or are you kind of pulling a bunch of things that you can measure and saying, here you go? At the end of the day, you need to work on that. Once you have that effort, once you have a confidence that you are getting good coverage, that that those data you're using are relatively precise, and that you are painting a picture that is somewhat holistic in terms of your risk posture, then you can move on to budgeting, and the budgeting exercise becomes relatively easy from there, right? Like, I mean, relatively. Am I pretty confident that these investments will buy down the risk as I've seen it in the things that I'm measuring? And then you can go back and you have to continually reassess. It helps to have tools that you use, and by tools I mean really anything. We have at the hospital kind of tossed out all of the things that we could find that to purchase to paint a picture. We'll give you your FICO score in cyber risk, or we'll tell you here's what your kind of external view looks like. For the most part, our executive leadership said, yeah, if you give me a score, I'm just going to assume you made up the numbers. I want to hear a set of things that are real, that I can understand. So in our case, we put together something called we refer to it as the Cyber Risk Index, and that's based very much on the work that my colleagues have done in terms of healthcare safety and quality, and looking across our hospital and saying, how do we improve in these areas? How do we measure the things that matter to drive outcomes around safety and quality? And they put together a dashboard that they use every month. It's been a 10 or 11 year effort. So we got to pick up the work that they had already done and then just transfer it over to the cyber arena. It's certainly taken a lot of effort, but we have 11 metrics that we use, and we say these are the real data-driven things that we, as my team believes together, will drive paint a holistic picture of our risk posture, and will drive those things down. I would say, and I want to just kind of pick up on the public policy side of this, since you've given me the floor for a second. We need help, right? So it's incredibly helpful that we have people looking at holistic, what's affecting us as a nation perspective, all of the great work of my former colleagues at NIST in terms of tools and risk management capabilities that we can leverage. But we need more help than that. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk to my colleagues here who might have some influence on this to say, as operators of critical infrastructure, we need money. And we need backstopping our insurance. Our insurance bills have gone through the roof now. This is a different conversation than the reinsurance one, but it is hard for hospitals to get insurance today, and many can't get cyber insurance. We're lucky in that we've been able to, but it's tough. And we need some regulatory harmonization, right? We struggle as hospitals. We struggle with the fact that FDA rules often preclude us from being able to protect ourselves from the devices and the tools that we buy. So there's a lot going on there, but there's a lot of opportunity.
That's a great segue into the next question. I do want to put it out there for all of the panelists, right? What are the policy tools? So maybe start with Carol and Bob, right? Like, what are the policy tools at our disposal that we can use to help backstop or bolster what Nate's talking about right now? And then Catherine and Nate, some more if you want. Like, what are the policies that we should be pushing forward? I mean, I know that there's everything from we can talk about cyber TRIA. Wouldn't explain what that is. We can talk about some of the rules like you were talking about with the FDA. We can talk about some of the policies, Carol, and that you guys put out there in the ransomware document. So just give us a sense of what's at people's disposal right now, and then we can talk about what our recommendations are.
Sure, I'm happy to kick it off. So I think a variety of things. First, I know I mentioned before information that industry and operators of critical infrastructure and key resources can really leverage to understand the nature of the threat based on information that gets posted in alerts from like NSA or DHS or FBI about the nature of cybercrime and cyber-enabled financial crime that's affecting institutions, the vulnerabilities that are being compromised, et cetera, as well as information about like what sorts of mitigating steps could best be put in place. All of those also tend to exist in those alerts, and also are a part of the in some cases public directives that have been issued underneath this administration or that are present in the cybersecurity EO. DNSA, Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger, actually last June published an open letter to CEOs in the wake of the Colonial incident, highlighting some of the basic cybersecurity protections that she was encouraging for CEOs to implement. So that really pointed to a lot of the best practices that were in the EO and other things that are the most impactful efforts that can be put in place to help make sure that you're not the victim of or can easily recover from ransomware, like multi-factor network detection and response technologies, encryption, backup systems, testing your incident response plan, patching, et cetera. So all those information resources are out there. I'd say also leverage partnerships. So part of our policy tool is to prioritize something and then make sure that there is actually that like ongoing dialogue and working together with priority sectors where there is a potential for severe impact. So under the water and wastewater sector action plan, we included some key actions like establishing a task force of water sector leaders, implementing pilot projects to demonstrate and accelerate adoption of incident monitoring, improving info sharing and data analysis, et cetera. So all of those can really point to where there's opportunities to drive additional partnerships and then leveraging those with us. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out that there really is currently no strategic coordinated requirement for cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. To the extent that there are mandatory cybersecurity requirements. Of course, this is tools for us, but for critical infrastructure, they're sector specific, like financial and chemical. They're mandated under state and local law, or they're limited and piecemeal. So short of legislation, there is no comprehensive way to require deployment of some of these security technologies and practices to address the current and near-term threat environment. That's just our reality. And then finally, since you mentioned budgeting, of course, resourcing is something that we can use and appreciate Congress funding a lot of these resources last year in legislation and looking forward to try to put those into practice to try to help through grants and others to states, help them make some of the investments that Nate was speaking to.
Thanks, Carol. And can you put some of the resources you're talking about in the chat when you get a chance? Just drop in some links.
I'm sorry, I don't have access to chat. Presidential.
That's right. That's right.
Exactly.
We'll follow up with the group after with some of the resources that you're mentioning. Bob, same question for you. What do we need what do we have from a policy standpoint? What do we need?
Yeah, so on top of, specifically to Nate and on top of Carol, I do think the Infrastructure Investment Act of last year, right, that put a lot of money into infrastructure. And one of the things we want to do at CISA, and we have been, is working with our interagency colleagues who have the more of the funding that goes through that process to put into the ecosystem, to see if this is an opportunity to make investments and to give guidance on how to make smart cybersecurity investments as part of infrastructure upgrades. And then as Carol alluded to, grants, we will have a grant program that we're kicking off for state, local, tribal, territorial government to help do that. Digital modernization, technology modernization. So I think the more resources that go into investing in America's infrastructure, the more opportunity that the cyber community has to be, say, let's buy down some cyber risk while we're making that investment. Nate, the other thing about regulatory harmonization, and Carol's absolutely right, that there's statutory reasons that regulatory harmonization is difficult, but at least we are trying as an interagency to get the regulators together, work toward a shared set of performance goals that we're developing for critical infrastructure, and hoping that those performance goals can serve as a sort of a North Star for regulators to harmonize on what they're trying to achieve. I mean, I think you'll hear all of us say we want regulation to be outcome-based when it exists and not process compliance-based. And if we define good outcomes, within the bounds of regulatory programs, that would be useful. Throw two more things on the list. Supply chain and investing in America's industrial base. We're about to complete a study. We're working with the Department of Commerce per the America's supply chain about some ideas to stimulate the information communications technology industrial base, not just necessarily onshore everything, but certainly more trusted and assured access to information communications technology. And there'll be a series of recommendations. That report comes out February 24th. Be a series of recommendations on that. And then near and dear to CISA's heart is software and software bill of materials and better understanding of pushing the market toward more transparency of software and push better software practices, which would of course drive to, if we're right, better contracting, a better marketplace that's out there. Because Nate, you're buying software, you're not evaluating every piece of software, and you're trusting the marketplace, and we got to give tools to make them a better marketplace.
That's helpful, Bob. And I do want to point out this a question in the Q&A if you have access to it. I'd love to get you to take a look at that. Catherine and Nate, we've got about 3 minutes left, so I'd love to just kind of close out with your thoughts on, from a policy perspective or from a money perspective, right? I mean, there's other tools out there like the Cybersecurity Responsible Recovery Fund. Like, what are the things that we need to either invest in or change from a policy standpoint to bolster and make sure that we have all the tools available to buy down that risk?
Well, as a career underwriter, I have to underscore everything that Carol said about improving cybersecurity. So exclamation point after everything Carol said. The way we think about it is in terms of 3 C's. So consequences, which Carol talked about earlier, disrupting the ecosystem of the ransomware economy. Number 2, you sort of touched on this, Ross, capital, which is kind of a TRIA style backstop for the insurance industry specific to cyber. And that's something that Aon have called on a study for the potential impact of a cyber terrorism event. And then 3 is collaboration, which both Carol and Bob have touched on extensively. And some of that is going on already. We don't think that's the silver bullet to all of this, but it really will improve the insurance industry's ability to refine our how we underwrite and price risk, and then therefore how much we can take on.
Yeah, so I guess I'll pick up on that the last thing that Catherine just said and say, collaboration is king for us too. I mentioned, organizational collaboration, but intra-organizational, we really think about how, like, what are the practical, tactical things we can do to shift those risk curves without spending a huge amount of additional money. So how do we move it so that it's easier to buy down risk? And one example that we're working on is across regionally, getting healthcare or even other critical infrastructure organizations, that's kind of easier within your own sector, to have a mutual defense pact, right? A kind of MOU that says for in the DC area, across the other hospitals, if one of them is hit with a massive ransomware attack, it's the recovery side that's going to be most costly from a resource perspective. We have the ability now to, we're putting in place, we don't have it yet, but we're working on putting in place the ability to surge staff to other hospitals, the same way we do for things like a massive, catastrophic weather event. And line workers can move from one region to another to help get the power back on. We need to be able to surge staff from hospital to hospital to ensure that we can re-image 1,000 devices a day, if that's what it takes to get a hospital back online. And so that's the kind of collaboration that we're doing. The other thing I guess I would hit on is this notion of like, we are today affected both by the commoditized attacks that everybody sees, right? And that's the day in, day out stuff that cyber hygiene really helps with. We also have to deal with the trickle down effects of nation state level attacks. You look at things like SolarWinds, and in a individual organization, even though we may not be the target of a nation state level highly sophisticated attack, it affects us too. Right? It doesn't stay contained, we get hit with it. And so we have to simultaneously mature the highly sophisticated end of our defense while continuing to do an outstanding job at the day-to-day commoditized attack defense. And I think that, I'd love to talk more with Bob, with you, with Carol, with you, and you and your colleagues, Chris and Ann, do great work at the White House. I think it would just be really helpful for us to better understand the kind of resources available, not just from an educational perspective. People in my line of work, we know what we need to do, we just can't do it all. And it ends up being very challenging. And what I think we need more than anything else today is frankly the money in grants to allow us to do a better job of actually buying down risk.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. I would like to say, thank you very much to the panelists, both this panel and previous panel. Thank you to NIST for letting us put this on and put this together. And this is not the end of the discussion, obviously. So we're gonna package up the videos. We're gonna put them together in an email out to all the people who registered for this event. So I would encourage the panelists, if you all have anything that you would like me to highlight, please send it to me via email. We'll make sure it's in the email that goes out from a resourcing standpoint so that folks who are listening can have access to some of the great resources that we pointed to, and we can advocate for the ones that we don't have yet. So thank you all very much, and thank you to NIST.
Thanks, Ross.
Great being with you.